Now imagine this. Beneath the Syrian desert, archaeologists uncover a hidden chamber. Inside, an ancient Roman inscription claiming something no textbook has ever dared to suggest. What if history didn't just forget something? What if it chose to? Hit that like button, subscribe, and get ready, because this discovery might change everything you thought you knew. The Syrian sun hung like a malevolent eye over the archaeological site, its rays penetrating even the canvas walls of the field tent where Dr. Marcus Antonius labored. At 42, he had spent more of his life among ancient stones than living people, a fact that suited him perfectly. His calloused hands, permanently stained with the dust of centuries, moved with practiced precision over fragments of first-century pottery. Another day brought another shard, another piece of evidence in humanity's endless narrative of rise and fall. The irony of his name was not lost on him. Marcus Antonius, bearing the name of a Roman general, yet feeling more kinship with the conquered than the conquerors. History, he had learned, was written by the victors, but archaeology was written by the dead. The site near the ancient city of Gadara had been his home for 3 months. What began as a routine excavation of a Roman garrison had taken an unexpected turn with the discovery of underground chambers, possibly dating to the time of Christ. The Israeli Antiquities Authority had granted him unprecedented access, trusting his reputation for meticulous documentation and his agnostic approach to religious artifacts. Marcus had built his career on objectivity, on the cold analysis of facts. Faith, in his view, was for those who couldn't handle the harsh realities of history, the endless cycles of conquest, suffering, and forgotten civilizations. His mentor, the late Professor Hartley, had instilled in him a cardinal rule: let the stones speak, but never let them sing. Truth was in the data, not in the dreams men projected onto ancient ruins. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the excavation site, a commotion arose from the direction of the newest dig. His assistant, Sarah Chen, appeared at the tent entrance, her usual composed demeanor shattered by obvious excitement. Young, brilliant, and frustratingly optimistic, she represented everything Marcus had once been before 20 years of digging up the dead had hardened his heart. She spoke rapidly about a discovery in room C7, the sealed chamber they had opened just yesterday. An inscription, she said, 1st century, original. And then her voice dropped as she mentioned something that made Marcus's hands still over his. Work, the inscription referenced the crucifixion darkness. The crucifixion darkness, those 3 hours of supernatural shadow described in the Gospels during Christ's death, had always fascinated Marcus as a historical anomaly. Various theories had been proposed over the centuries: solar eclipse, sandstorm, volcanic ash. But no contemporary Roman or Jewish sources outside the biblical texts had ever corroborated the event. Until now, perhaps. Marcus followed Sarah through the labyrinth of excavated rooms and corridors. The site had clearly been more than a military garrison, possibly a records repository or administrative center. As they descended into the earth, the temperature dropped, and the smell of ancient stone filled his nostrils. 2,000 years of silence seemed to press against his eardrums. Chamber C7 was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of fitted stone that had remained remarkably intact. Sarah's team had installed LED lights that cast harsh shadows on the ancient surfaces. There, on the eastern wall, was the inscription that would change everything. Marcus approached it with the caution of a man approaching the edge of a cliff. The text was in Greek, carved with obvious haste but surprising skill. As his trained eye translated the ancient letters, his hands began to tremble. I, Gaius Cassius Longinus, Centurion of the Legio Exfratensis, do testify to what my eyes have seen and what my soul can no longer deny. On the day the Nazarene died, the sun itself refused to watch. The earth shook with the grief of heaven, and the stones themselves cried out. I have overseen 100 crucifixions, but only one has torn the veil between earth and sky. The name struck him like a physical blow. Longinus, the Centurion. From the Gospels, the soldier who, according to church tradition, had declared Jesus the Son of God. If this inscription was authentic, it represented the archaeological find of the century, an eyewitness account of the crucifixion from a Roman soldier. But there was more. Below the main inscription, in smaller letters, a personal addendum had been carved. "I leave this record for those who seek truth in the darkness. What died on that cross was not merely a man. What rose from that tomb was not merely a legend. I have seen empires rise and fall, but I have seen only one man conquer death. Seek the tribune's account in the hidden archive. There you will find what Rome tried to bury. The hidden archive." Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. If authentic, and every instinct honed by 2 decades of fieldwork told him it was. Then somewhere in this complex lay a cache of documents that could revolutionize their understanding of first-century Palestine. Sarah waited expectantly, her eyes shining with the thrill of discovery. Marcus could see in her the same passion that had once driven him before disillusionment had set in. He instructed her to bring the imaging team immediately to document everything with their most precise equipment, and most importantly to tell no one else, not yet. Alone in the chamber, Marcus stared at the inscription. The rational part of his mind was already cataloguing possibilities: forgery, misinterpretation, wishful thinking. But another part, a part he thought had atrophied years ago, whispered dangerous questions. What if it's true? What if the stories you've dismissed as mythology have roots in witnessed reality? The stone walls seemed to press closer, and Marcus felt the weight of centuries bearing down on him. He had spent his life among the dead, carefully maintaining professional distance from their beliefs and passions. But now in this small chamber beneath the Syrian earth, the past was reaching out with ghostly fingers to grasp his carefully constructed skepticism. Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert sky, unusual for this time of year. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he stood at the edge of an abyss, and that his next step would either shatter everything he believed or lead him to truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He reached out and touched the inscription, his fingers tracing the ancient Greek letters. The stone was cool beneath his touch, but he imagined he could feel the urgency with which these words had been carved, the desperate need of a soldier to record what he had witnessed. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus Antonius, archaeologist and professional skeptic, felt the stirring of something he had thought lost forever: wonder. And with it came fear, not of the unknown but of the possibly known, of truths that might demand more than academic acknowledgement. In the silence of the ancient chamber, with only the dead as witnesses, Marcus began to understand that some discoveries couldn't be catalogued and filed away. Some stones, once made to speak, would never stop singing. The summons. The days following the discovery blurred together in a frenzy of careful documentation and barely contained excitement. Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even his veteran team members. Every photograph, every measurement, every spectrographic analysis was conducted with obsessive precision. Yet beneath his professional rigor lay an undercurrent of something else, a tremor of uncertainty that grew stronger with each passing hour. The inscription's authenticity had been confirmed through multiple dating methods. The stone showed the correct weathering patterns for first-century carving, the Greek dialect matched the period perfectly, and microscopic analysis revealed mineral deposits consistent with 2 millennia of undisturbed aging. By every measure available to modern archaeology, they had uncovered a genuine contemporary account of the crucifixion. But authenticity was only the beginning of the mystery. The mention of a hidden archive consumed Marcus's thoughts. Roman administrative centers often contained document storage areas, but the centurion's words suggested something more, a deliberately concealed cache of records that Rome had wanted buried. Sleep became elusive. Marcus found himself returning to the chamber at odd hours, standing before the inscription, as if it might reveal additional secrets through sheer persistence. The rational framework that had guided his career began to show cracks like fault lines in ancient stone. It was during one of these late-night vigils that the second discovery came. Sarah, equally unable to rest, had been mapping the chamber with ground-penetrating radar. The results showed an anomaly in the northern wall, a void behind what appeared to be solid stone. Marcus watched as the team carefully removed a section of the wall, revealing a narrow passage that had been deliberately sealed. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Without modern technology, the hidden entrance would have remained invisible. Beyond lay a corridor that descended deeper into the earth, its walls inscribed with Latin text. Tribune vies laticlavivs legionis ex fretensis, tribune of the broad stripe, 10th Legion Fretensis, a senior officer's title. Marcus's pulse quickened as he followed the passage, LED lights revealing more inscriptions along the way. These weren't hastily carved testimonies, but carefully planned records, as if someone had anticipated their eventual discovery. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and what they found there defied all expectations. Stone shelves lined the walls, still holding ceramic jars sealed with wax. A quick count revealed over 40 vessels, each one potentially containing documents from the 1st century. But it was the central pedestal that drew Marcus's attention. Upon it sat a single scroll case of unusual design, marked with both Roman military insignia and symbols that seemed distinctly Jewish. The convergence of cultures in this one artifact spoke of a story more complex than simple conquest and submission. Marcus's hands trembled as he photographed the scene. Every instinct told him they had discovered something unprecedented, not just historical records, but documents that someone had risked everything to preserve. The air in the chamber felt charged with purpose, as if the very stones had been waiting 2,000 years to discharge their burden. The team worked through the night, carefully extracting the first of the ceramic jars. Using techniques developed for the Dead Sea Scrolls, they managed to retrieve an intact papyrus. The text was in Latin, written in the precise hand of a Roman scribe. In the consulship of Tiberius Caesar Augustus' 15th year of reign, I, Lucius Aurelius Primus, tribune of the 10th Legion, do set down this record at great risk to my position and life. The events surrounding the execution of the Galilean prophet Jesus require documentation beyond the official reports, for I fear that truth itself is being crucified alongside the innocent. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not literally, though in that moment he wouldn't have been surprised. Here was a Roman tribune, a member of the aristocratic class, writing what amounted to a dissenting report about one of history's most significant events. Over the following days, more documents emerged. Personal letters between Roman officials, expressing unease about the trial of Jesus. Reports from soldiers describing inexplicable phenomena during the crucifixion. Most remarkably, a collection of testimonies from Jewish leaders who had privately questioned the proceedings against the Nazarene. Each revelation chipped away at Marcus's carefully constructed worldview. He had spent his career studying the bones of history, maintaining safe analytical distance from the flesh and blood realities of the past. But these documents refused to remain academic. They spoke of confusion, fear, wonder, and transformation. They painted a picture of an event that had shaken not just Jerusalem, but the very foundations of those who witnessed it. The seal on the central scroll case proved particularly challenging. Analysis showed it had been designed to break if opened improperly, potentially destroying the contents. It took 3 days of painstaking work to devise a method of accessing the scroll without damaging it. When they finally succeeded, Marcus found himself holding what appeared to be a comprehensive account written by Tribune Lucius Aurelius Primus himself. The opening line sent a chill down his spine. To those who will one day read these words, know that I write as a man whose eyes have been opened to truths that Rome would deny and Jerusalem would forget. I was present at the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. I stood at Golgotha during his execution. I witnessed what no Roman report will ever record, and I have seen what no Jewish leader will publicly acknowledge. The death of this man was accompanied by signs that force me to question everything I have believed about the nature of our world and the gods who rule it. Marcus set down the document with unsteady hands. Around him, his team continued their work, but he felt suddenly isolated, as if standing at the edge of a vast precipice. The scholar in him recognized the monumental historical significance of their find, but another part of him, a part growing stronger each day, sensed that he was being drawn into something far more personal than professional discovery. That night, alone in his tent, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just days before. He would translate the Tribune's account himself, word by word, allowing the ancient voice to speak directly to him across the centuries. He sensed that this was more than an archaeological project now. It was becoming a journey into questions he had spent his adult life avoiding. As he prepared his workspace, thunder rolled across the desert again. Through the tent flaps, he could see lightning illuminating the excavation site in stark momentary clarity. The strobe effect made the ancient stones seem to move, as if the past were stirring to life. Marcus opened his laptop and began to type. Translation of the Tribune's account, Day 1. His fingers hesitated over the keys. Then, almost without conscious thought, he added a subtitle, A Personal Journey into the Darkness of History. He didn't yet realize that the darkness he was about to explore would prove to be not the obscurity of the past, but the shadows in his own soul that had prevented him from seeing truth when it stood before him all along. The call had been issued, not by human voices, but by stones that had waited 2 millennia to sing their song, and Marcus Antonius, skeptic and scholar, was finally ready to listen. Confronting shadows, the Tribune's account consumed Marcus's days and haunted his nights. Each page revealed a narrative that challenged not just historical assumptions but the very foundations upon which he had built his career. Lucius Aurelius Primus wrote with the precision of a military officer and the anguish of a man whose worldview had been shattered. I had seen death in many forms, the Tribune wrote. In Germania, I watched thousands fall to sword and spear. In Syria, I witnessed the slow agony of siege warfare, but nothing prepared me for the death I observed on that hill outside Jerusalem. This was not merely the execution of a criminal, it was a cosmic event masquerading as a routine crucifixion. Marcus worked alone in his tent, having dismissed offers of assistance from his team. This had become deeply personal. As he translated, he found himself drawn into the Tribune's world, experiencing the events through ancient eyes that saw with startling clarity. The account described the trial before Pilate in detail that no gospel provided. The Tribune had been present as an observer, tasked with assessing any threat to Roman stability. His initial impressions of Jesus had been dismissive, another, Jewish mystic claiming divine authority. But as the proceedings unfolded, something changed. The accused stood with a composure that unnerved even Pilate, Primus recorded. When questioned about his kingdom, he spoke of truth as if it were a realm unto itself. I have interrogated many prisoners, but none who seemed to interrogate their interrogators merely by their presence. Page by page, the story unfolded. The Tribune described the political pressures, the careful maneuvering between Roman authority and Jewish religious law. He wrote of Pilate's obvious reluctance, the governor's attempts to avoid responsibility. But it was the account of the crucifixion itself that made Marcus's hands tremble as he typed. The darkness came without warning, Primus wrote. Not the gradual dimming of an eclipse, which our astronomers could predict, but a sudden weight of shadow that felt almost tangible. The sun didn't merely hide, it abdicated its throne in the sky. I have studied natural philosophy, and I tell you this darkness obeyed no natural law. Marcus paused in his translation, his tent suddenly feeling too small. Outside, the Syrian afternoon blazed with heat, but he felt cold. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Sandstorms, volcanic ash, mass hysteria. But the Tribune's words carried a conviction that transcended easy dismissal. The account continued with details that made Marcus's archaeological heart race. Primus described the earthquake that struck at the moment of Jesus' death, not with the clinical detachment of a historian, but with the awe of a witness to the impossible. The earth convulsed as if in grief. I saw rocks split apart, not from the tremors, but as if they were rending their garments in mourning. The Centurion Longinus fell to his knees, crying out words that could end his career, perhaps his life. Truly, this was the Son of God. I wanted to rebuke him for his superstition, but my own voice failed me. In that moment, I too knew that we had killed someone extraordinary. As the days passed, Marcus found himself changing. The clinical distance he had always maintained from his subjects began to erode. He started arriving at the site before dawn, watching the sunrise over the ancient stones. The same sun that had allegedly refused to shine 2,000 years ago now painted the excavation in hues of gold and crimson. His team noticed the change. Sarah approached him one morning with concern written across her face. She spoke of his withdrawn behavior, his apparent obsession with the tribune's account. Marcus wanted to reassure her, to return to his role as the steady, skeptical leader. But he couldn't. The questions raised by the documents had taken root in his mind like seeds in fertile soil. The tribune's narrative took an even more extraordinary turn as it described the aftermath of the crucifixion. Primus had been assigned to investigate reports of disturbances at the tomb. What he found there challenged everything he believed about death and reality. The guards spoke of light that burned without heat, of figures that appeared and vanished, of a stone that moved without human hands. I would have dismissed their accounts as the fantasies of frightened soldiers, but I knew these men. They were veterans who had faced Germanic berserkers without flinching, yet they trembled as they spoke of what they had witnessed at the tomb. Marcus set down his laptop and walked to the excavation site. The hidden archive had yielded more documents, testimonies from other Romans, accounts from Jewish leaders who had privately investigated the resurrection claims, even fragments of correspondence between Pilate and Rome that never made it into official histories. Each document added another layer to the mystery. A Pharisee named Nicodemus had written a detailed analysis of Jesus' teachings, concluding that they represented not heresy, but the fulfillment of prophecies his colleagues refused to acknowledge. A Roman physician had documented the medical impossibility of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, making the resurrection claims even more troubling. But it was a personal letter from the tribune to his wife that affected Marcus most deeply. "My beloved Julia, I write to you from a place of darkness that has nothing to do with the Syrian night. I have witnessed something that calls into question everything I have believed about our gods, our empire, our very existence. The Jewish prophet we executed, I can no longer think of him as merely that. What if their God is not just another deity in the pantheon, but something else entirely? What if we have been players in a drama whose scope we cannot comprehend? I fear for my sanity, yet I fear more for my soul." Marcus found himself walking the site at night, drawn particularly to the chamber where Longinus's inscription had been found. The centurion's words echoed in his mind. What died on that cross was not merely a man. The convergence of testimonies, Roman, Jewish, military, civilian, created a weight of evidence that his scholarly training couldn't easily dismiss. As he stood in the darkness of the ancient chamber, Marcus confronted the implications of what he was uncovering. If these accounts were true, if the events they described had actually occurred, then history itself needed rewriting. But more than that, his own carefully constructed philosophy of existence, his faith in reason, his dismissal of the supernatural, his reduction of human experience to archaeological data, all of it stood on foundations as shaky as the earthquake-torn ground of ancient Jerusalem. The LED lights cast harsh shadows on the walls, and for a moment, Marcus imagined he could see the ghosts of those who had stood here before. Longinus struggling with his conscience, Primus documenting truths that Rome would try to bury, Jewish leaders torn between political expediency and spiritual conviction. He thought of his mentor, Professor Hartley, and his admonition to let stones speak but never sing. But these stones were singing now, a chorus that spoke of darkness and light, death and resurrection, doubt and faith. The song was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus made a decision that night. He would follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it meant confronting beliefs he had held sacred for 20 years. The descent into darkness that the tribune described was becoming his own journey, not into the shadows of the past, but into the unexplored depths of his own resistant heart. As he returned to his tent, a shooting star streaked across the desert sky. Marcus had seen many such phenomena and knew the scientific explanation, a piece of cosmic debris burning up in Earth's atmosphere. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to wonder if such events might carry meaning beyond their physical properties. The translation work continued, but it was no longer merely an academic exercise. Each word became a step deeper into mystery, each revelation a challenge to his cultivated skepticism. Marcus was beginning to understand that some truths couldn't be excavated with brush and trowel. Some truths demanded not just intellectual acknowledgement, but personal transformation. In the hidden archive beneath the Syrian desert, surrounded by testimonies of the impossible, Marcus Antonius was discovering that the greatest archaeological find might not be in the documents themselves, but in what they were unearthing within his own buried soul. Shattered foundations, the desert storm. Struck without warning, Marcus had experienced Syrian sandstorms before, but this one carried an unusual fury, as if the earth itself was protesting the secrets being dragged from its depths. The excavation site had to be secured hastily, sensitive documents moved to protective storage, equipment covered and anchored against the scouring wind. It was during this chaos that the accident occurred. Sarah, attempting to retrieve crucial imaging equipment from the hidden archive, became trapped when a support beam, weakened by the recent excavations, gave way. The collapse was partial but devastating. Tons of ancient stone sealed the entrance to the chamber where she was working. Marcus arrived at the scene to find his team in panic. The usual protocol seemed inadequate against the reality of a colleague, a friend, buried beneath centuries of rock. Rescue equipment was summoned from Damascus, but the storm made transportation nearly impossible. Hours stretched into an eternity of desperate excavation by hand, the storm howling overhead like the voices of the ancient dead. As they worked, Marcus found his carefully maintained composure crumbling like the walls around them. Sarah was trapped in the very chamber where they had discovered the tribune's final testament, a scroll that Marcus had been planning to examine that very day. The irony was bitter. In their hunger to uncover the past, they had awakened forces that now threatened to claim a life in the present. The rescue efforts continued through the night. Between shifts of digging, Marcus retreated to his tent, where the translated accounts lay scattered across his desk. The tribune's words seemed to mock him now. I fear that in seeking truth we sometimes disturb powers better left sleeping. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself attempting something like prayer. Not the formal recitations of his childhood, but a raw, desperate plea to whatever forces might exist beyond the material world. If the accounts were true, if Jesus had indeed conquered death, then surely death could be held at bay for one young archaeologist whose only crime was curiosity. The storm intensified. Radio contact with the outside world became sporadic. The team was effectively isolated, cut off from modern resources, thrown back on their own ingenuity and determination. It was, Marcus reflected grimly, not unlike the isolation the ancient witnesses must have felt as they grappled with events that defied explanation. On the second night, exhausted and covered in dust, Marcus made a decision that would have appalled his former self. He returned to the tribune's account, not as a scholar seeking knowledge, but as a desperate man seeking hope. The final pages, which he had not yet translated, called to him with urgent promise. Working by lamplight while the storm raged outside, Marcus immersed himself in the tribune's concluding testimony. I write these final words knowing they may never be read, yet compelled by a force greater than Roman duty or personal safety. I have seen the one they call risen, not in dreams or visions, but in the flesh that bears the marks of crucifixion, yet lives and breathes and speaks with authority that makes Caesar's power seem like a child's game. He appeared to us, to me, to Longinus, to others who cannot be dismissed as hysterical followers. He spoke of forgiveness for those who had overseen his execution. He spoke of a kingdom not built on sword and stone, but on truth and spirit. I, who have served Rome's might my entire life, found myself kneeling before a different kind of power entirely. Let those who find these words know, the world is not what we thought. Death is not final. The divine is not distant. And we are all of us, Roman and Jew, slave and citizen, standing before a mystery that demands not just acknowledgement, but decision. Marcus's hands shook as he typed these words. Outside, the storm had become a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But inside the tent, in the circle of lamplight, a different kind of upheaval was taking place. The carefully constructed edifice of Marcus's skepticism, already weakened by weeks of revelation, finally collapsed entirely. 20 years of academic atheism, of reducing human experience to archaeological data. of explaining away the miraculous as myth. All of it crumbled like the walls that had trapped Sarah. In that moment of collapse came clarity. Marcus understood, with sudden, terrible insight, that his rejection of faith had been its own kind of religion, a desperate attempt to control a universe too vast and mysterious for human comprehension. He had worshipped at the altar of his own intellect, offered sacrifices of cynicism to keep the divine at bay. But the divine, it seemed, was not so easily dismissed. Dawn brought two miracles. The storm broke, dissipating as suddenly as it had arrived. And from the excavation site came shouts of triumph. They had broken through to the chamber. Sarah emerged, dusty and exhausted, but miraculously unharmed. She had survived in an air pocket created by the very scroll cases that had drawn her to the chamber. As medical personnel attended to Sarah, she grasped Marcus's hand with surprising strength. Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they struck him with prophetic force. "I wasn't alone in there, Dr. Antonius. I can't explain it, but I felt protected, like someone was watching over me." Marcus returned to his tent, but not to work. Instead, he sat in silence, wrestling with implications that threatened to reshape not just his understanding of the past, but his vision of the future. The documents they had uncovered spoke of transformation, Romans who abandoned their gods, Jews who recognized their Messiah, skeptics who became believers. Was he now to be added to that ancient list? The fall of his skepticism was complete, but what would rise in its place remained uncertain. Marcus thought of the tribune's final words about standing before a mystery that demanded decision. The archaeological discovery of the century had become a personal crossroads, and Marcus Antonius, who had spent his life exhuming the dead, was being called to choose life. Outside, the clearing sky revealed the excavation site transformed by the storm. Sand had shifted, revealing previously hidden sections of the ancient complex. It was as if the earth itself was participating in the unveiling of truth, no longer content to hide what had been buried for 2 millennia. Marcus emerged from his tent to find his team gathered around a newly exposed section of wall. There, carved in stone that had been protected from weathering by its burial, was an image that made his breath catch. It was a rough but unmistakable depiction of 3 crosses on a hill, with the central figure surrounded by radiating lines suggesting light or glory. Below the image, in multiple languages, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, were the words, "He is not here. He is risen." The morning sun broke over the horizon, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and crimson. Marcus stood among the ruins of the past and the wreckage of his former beliefs, feeling paradoxically more alive than he had in 20 years. The fall had been complete, the foundations shattered, but sometimes he was beginning to understand things needed to fall apart before they could be properly rebuilt. Spiritual reconstruction. The weeks following the storm brought a transformation to both the excavation site and to Marcus himself. The near tragedy with Sarah had shaken the entire team, but it had also forged a deeper bond among them. The work continued with renewed purpose, as if they all sensed they were involved in something far greater than academic discovery. Marcus found himself changing in ways that would have horrified his former self. The clinical detachment he had cultivated for decades gave way to a more profound engagement with the materials they were uncovering. Each new document was no longer merely data to be catalogued, but a voice from the past speaking directly to the present. The hidden archive yielded its greatest treasure in those post-storm days, a collection of personal testimonies from individuals who claimed to have encountered the risen Christ. These weren't second-hand accounts or theological treatises, but raw, immediate records of transformation. A Roman soldier named Flavius wrote of abandoning his post to follow the new faith, knowing it meant death if captured. A Jewish merchant described giving away his wealth after an encounter that convinced him the kingdom of God held more value than gold. A Greek physician documented his journey from skepticism to belief after investigating the medical evidence of the resurrection. But it was a letter from Longinus himself that pierced Marcus most deeply. "To my son who may never know his father, I write this on the eve of my departure from Jerusalem, knowing I may not survive the journey. I have seen what cannot be unseen, known what cannot be unknown. The man I helped execute has conquered death itself. This truth burns within me like fire, demanding to be shared regardless of cost. If these words reach you, know that your Father chose truth over safety, light over comfortable darkness. May you have the courage to do the same. Marcus read these words in the pre-dawn quiet of his tent, and for the first time in 20 years he wept, not from sorrow, but from a recognition that broke through all his defenses. These ancient voices were calling him to the same choice. They had faced truth over comfort, transformation over stagnation. Sarah's recovery had been swift, but she spoke often of her experience in the collapsed chamber. She described a presence, a sense of being held in safety despite the tons of rock above her. Her account aligned eerily with testimonies they were uncovering from the 1st century, stories of divine intervention that skeptics would dismiss as trauma-induced hallucination. But Marcus could no longer dismiss anything so easily. The evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent across sources that had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. Romans, Jews, Greeks, Syrians, all telling variations of the same impossible tale. Death defeated, the divine made flesh, lives transformed by encounter with the resurrected. The excavation expanded. What had begun as a simple garrison dig had revealed a complex that served as a kind of underground refuge for early believers. They found Christian symbols, predating any previously discovered, inscriptions that quoted words of Jesus not recorded in any gospel, and evidence of a community that transcended ethnic and social boundaries in ways that defied 1st century norms. Marcus began each day differently now. Instead of immediately diving into work, he would stand at the site's eastern edge, watching the sunrise paint the ancient stones. The same sun that had allegedly hidden its face at the crucifixion now seemed to illuminate truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. His translation work took on a meditative quality. The tribune's complete account revealed a man transformed by his investigation. Primus had started as a dutiful Roman officer, conducting a routine inquiry into potential sedition. He ended as a convert who used his position to protect early Christians and preserve their testimonies. I have served Rome all my life, the tribune's final entry read, but I now serve a kingdom that will outlast all empires. The Jewish prophet we killed has proven stronger than death, and his message of forgiveness and transformation spreads like wildfire despite our efforts to contain it. I add my witness to those who have gone before. Jesus of Nazareth, called the Christ, is everything his followers claimed and more. In seeking to investigate him, I have been investigated by him. In judging his claims, I have been judged by his truth. And in that judgment, I have found not condemnation, but invitation to a life I never imagined possible. Marcus shared these discoveries with his team, no longer hiding behind professional objectivity. The site became a place of pilgrimage even before the official reports were filed. Scholars, believers, and seekers arrived daily, drawn by rumors of discoveries that bridged the gap between faith and history. One evening, as the team gathered for their daily debrief, Marcus found himself speaking from his heart rather than his head. We came here as archaeologists, seekers of facts and artifacts, but we've uncovered something that demands more than academic analysis. These aren't just historical documents, they're testimonies of transformation. The question isn't whether these events happened. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, what do we do with this truth? The silence that followed was profound, but not uncomfortable. Each team member was grappling with their own response to that question. Some, like Sarah, had already embraced faith. Others remained cautious, intellectual acceptance not yet yielding to personal commitment. Marcus continued his work, but with a different spirit. The resurrection accounts were no longer ancient history but present reality. The transformation described by Romans and Jews 2,000 years ago was happening within him now. The skeptic was becoming a seeker, the cynic a believer. One night, alone in the chamber where Longinus had carved his testimony, Marcus added his own inscription to the ancient walls. Not with chisel and hammer, but with a simple marker, he wrote, Marcus Antonius, archaeologist of the 21st century, bears witness. The stones have sung their song, and it is true. What was buried has been raised. What was lost has been found. What was dead has come to life, both in history and in this searcher's heart. The hidden archive had one final gift. In a previously overlooked container, they found a small codex, an early form of book, containing what appeared to be a first-century account of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. The text included details that aligned perfectly with gospel accounts while adding new layers of witness. But the last page contained something unexpected, a prophetic word about future discoveries. Let those who uncover these words in distant times know that they were preserved for this purpose, that faith might be strengthened by evidence, that seekers might become finders, that the dead might be raised to life. The same power that conquered death in Jerusalem operates still, transforming hearts of stone into flesh, making all things new. Marcus read these words as personal message across 2 millennia. The resurrection he had been investigating was not merely a historical event, but a present reality. The transformation documented in ancient testimonies was available still to those brave enough to embrace it. As the excavation neared its end, Marcus faced a choice. He could return to academia with the find of the century, secure fame and fortune, with books and lectures about the historical Jesus. Or he could do what the ancient witnesses had done, allow the truth to transform not just his understanding, but his life itself. Standing among the stones that had hidden truth for 20 centuries, watching the sun set over the Syrian desert, Marcus made his choice. The resurrection of faith was complete. The skeptic had become a witness, the archaeologist an apostle of sorts. The stones had sung their song. And Marcus Antonius, who had spent his life among the dead, had finally learned to live. Closure and eternal message. The morning of departure carried the weight of ending and beginning simultaneously. The excavation site, which had been Marcus's world for months, stood transformed in the early light, no longer just an archaeological dig, but a place where past and present had collided with eternal implications. The team gathered for a final ceremony of sorts. The artifacts had been carefully catalogued, the documents preserved with cutting-edge techniques, the site mapped with exhaustive precision. Soon, the academic world would be shaken by their discoveries. Museums would compete for exhibitions. Scholars would debate interpretations for generations. But for those who had lived through the uncovering, the impact was far more personal. Marcus stood before the entrance to the hidden archive, holding a sealed container. Inside was his own testimony, not an academic paper but a personal account, of transformation. Just as Longinus and Primus and countless others had left their witness in stone and papyrus, Marcus was adding his voice to the eternal chorus. "I came here as a grave digger," he had written, exhuming the past with clinical detachment. "I leave as a witness to resurrection, not just of a man 2,000 years ago, but of faith in this modern skeptic's heart." The evidence compelled intellectual acceptance. The experience demanded personal transformation. Sarah approached, her recovery complete but her eyes carrying new depth. She had faced death in the darkness below and emerged with unshakable conviction. She spoke of establishing a foundation to ensure their discoveries would be accessible, not just to academics, but to seekers of all backgrounds. The truth they had uncovered was too important to be locked away in ivory towers. The final surprise came as they prepared to seal the site for protection. In a section exposed by the storm, they discovered one last inscription. Unlike the others, this one was not a testimony of the past, but seemed to speak directly to the future. "To those who have found what was hidden, you are now carriers of the flame. What was revealed in darkness must be proclaimed in light. The story continues, and you are its new chapters." Marcus felt the weight of commission in those words. The archaeological discovery was ending, but a greater adventure was beginning. He thought of the tribune's transformation from investigator to evangelist, of Longinus's journey from executioner to witness. History, it seemed, had a way of repeating its patterns. The convoy of vehicles waited to carry the team and their treasures back to civilization. As they loaded the last equipment, Marcus took a final walk through the site. Each chamber held memories now, not just of ancient lives but of his own spiritual archaeology. He had excavated more than stones. He had uncovered buried faith. Standing where the storm had revealed the image of 3 crosses, Marcus reflected on the journey. He had begun by seeking to understand how a crucified prophet had changed history. He was leaving with the knowledge that the same prophet continued to change lives 2 millennia later. The academic paper he would write would shake the archaeological world. The evidence was too strong, the sources too diverse, the preservation too remarkable to be dismissed. But Marcus knew the real impact would come not from scholarly journals, but from personal testimonies, modern witnesses adding their voices to the ancient chorus. As the convoy began its journey back to Damascus, Marcus opened his laptop to write a letter to his old mentor's widow. Professor Hartley had died, still clinging to his rationalism, but his wife had always maintained a quiet faith that her husband had gently mocked. "Dear Margaret," Marcus began, "your husband taught me to let stones speak but never sing. I write to tell you that I have heard them singing, and the song is more beautiful than I ever imagined. The evidence we've uncovered proves what you always believed, that some truths transcend academic analysis, that some stories demand not just study, but participation." The desert rolled past the windows, the same landscape that had witnessed countless travelers over millennia. Traders and soldiers, pilgrims and prophets, all following their paths through the dust and heat. Now Marcus joined their number, but his destination was no longer just a place, but a person whose reality had broken through the barriers of time and skepticism. The implications stretched before him like the desert horizon. There would be lectures to give, books to write, debates to engage. But beneath all the academic activity would pulse a deeper purpose, bearing witness to resurrection power that was not confined to ancient history, but remained active in the present. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues around the world. News of the discovery was already spreading through academic networks. Oxford wanted him for a speaking tour. The Smithsonian was preparing an exhibition. Publishers were bidding for book rights. But Marcus was thinking beyond academic fame. He remembered the tribune's words about serving a kingdom that would outlast all empires. The discoveries in Syria were not just about the past, but about eternal realities that demanded present response. Sarah, sitting across from him in the vehicle, was already planning. She spoke of documentary films, accessible books, conferences that would bring together scholars and believers. The hidden archive would be hidden no more. Its truths would be proclaimed from academic podiums and church pulpits alike. As Damascus appeared on the horizon, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had been entrusted with truth that could transform lives as it had transformed his. The skeptic who had arrived in Syria months ago was gone, replaced by a man who had encountered evidence that demanded everything. The story that began with a routine excavation was ending with revolutionary discovery. But Marcus understood now that some endings were really beginnings, that some deaths led to resurrection, that some who sought only to investigate the past found themselves recruited into an eternal present. He thought of all those who would encounter these discoveries, the skeptics who would wrestle with evidence they couldn't dismiss, the believers who would find their faith confirmed, the seekers who would discover what they hadn't known they were looking for. The hidden archive had given up its secrets, but the greater mystery remained. Not how a crucified prophet had changed history, but how he continued to change hearts across the centuries. Marcus had become part of that ongoing story, another link in the chain of witnesses stretching from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. As the convoy entered Damascus, the ancient city where another skeptic named Saul had once encountered the risen Christ, Marcus closed his laptop and prepared for the next phase of his journey. The excavation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. He had come to Syria seeking artifacts and found truth. He had investigated the resurrection and been resurrected himself. The stones had sung their song, and Marcus Antonius would spend the rest of his life ensuring others heard the melody. The sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of glory. Night would come, as it always did, but morning would follow. As it always had since that first Easter dawn, when death itself was defeated and hope was reborn for all who dared to believe. In the hidden archive of his own transformed heart, Marcus carried treasures more valuable than all the artifacts they had uncovered. He had found what the ages had sought, not just evidence of the divine, but encounter with it. Not just proof of resurrection, but participation in it. The testimony was complete, the witness had been given. The stone that the builders rejected had become the cornerstone of a new life. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, other seekers were beginning their own journeys toward the light that no darkness could overcome.